It's been a real pleasure collaborating with Archivio Conz. It's a fantastic collection. It's wonderful that it's here in Berlin. And it's an honor to follow this beautiful prayer by Kinga. So, Typewriter Terror. It's not too long, 25 minutes maximum. Okay. Shortly before he died, I had the pleasure of both reading and spending some time with Berlin's own Professor Friedrich Kittler. I'm sure a friend of yours. For all his work's subtleties, its nuance and complexity, there was also something beautifully simple or simplifying about it, where other academics restlessly assessed and reconfigured authors' place and function within literary history according to their role in movements or the development of style, their relation to emergent concepts, or their contribution to the general destiny of metaphysics, Kittler brought it all down to a question so obvious we'd been missing it for centuries. Where do they sit within the genealogy of media technology? In other words, what did they write with? How does the compositing machinery, its operational logic, shape their work? From the moment I read that, I knew exactly where I sat in this continuum. I sat and sit and stand before you as a representative of the last generation of writers to have ever used a typewriter. In fact, I've used several. In early 90s Prague, where I moved after finishing university, I hammered out juvenilia on a zeta and repeatedly mangled the correct Czech word for typewriter, psací stroj, or writing machine, into spací stroj, sleep, or as William Burroughs would have called it, dream machine. Psací stroj, spací stroj. In Berlin around the same time, I picked up one of the many ex-Stasi Ericas flooding the flow marks. In London, I wrote my first published article on an old Imperial. But my first encounter with a typewriter and my foundational moment as a writer came a decade and a half earlier when I was still a child. My mother, perhaps to send me to sleep, or perhaps to stop me and my siblings fighting on a car journey, had recounted the story of Macbeth, or to be precise, recounted not just the events of Macbeth, the regicide, the psychic and political unravelling, the ineluctable because prescripted march of both fate and the very woods towards Macbeth's demise, but also Macbeth as an event of literature, whose author, Shakespeare, was as much a character, an agent, as its generals and thanes and witches. I identified immediately with that character rather than the others. Within that narrative galaxy, that laid out constellation of actor personae, the thing to be, I told myself, is that guy, Shakespeare, the one who gets to write. We didn't have a typewriter then, but my friend's parents, 3 or 4 doors down the street in London, did. So I turned up at their house and commandeered this. If being a writer was the portal to the Macbeth event field, the typewriter, in turn, seemed then, in the late 70s, the sole and natural portal to that portal, platform vehicle for that agentic position. For some hours in their house, I sat at it and typed, Macbeth by Tom McCarthy. Shouldn't it be by Shakespeare? My friend's mother asked. No, I answered, bemused. Why? I'm typing it. I typed in very slowly with one finger my own version of the dialogue between Duncan and the captain who reports on Macbeth's bravery in battle. Then, when I couldn't remember exactly what comes next, I transcribed letter for letter the lines from the complete Shakespeare that my friend's mother kindly brought me, until somewhere in the middle of Act 1, Scene 4, I grew tired of it all and went outside to play. This story, in particular, my presumption that my name should top the title page, became an in-joke in my family. It wasn't until years later that I realized that, in fact, by the same logic that leads Borges to insist that Pierre Menard is composing, not copying, Don Quixote, even as he replicates it word for word, I was indeed the author of that Macbeth instantiation. Hadn't Shakespeare also transcribed, word for word, whole passages of it from Holinshed and Seneca? It wasn't until reading Kittler, though, that a second, more material line of kinship came fully into focus, one centering around my fetishizing of the typewriter. Shakespeare, a Kittlerian avant la lettre, accords a primary importance to writing's technologies, for example, by foregrounding in the manner of a concrete poet typographic layout itself in the cryptic hourglass-shaped dedication page of his sonnets, or in Sonnet 55's assertion that it is in black ink that his love will shine bright. Or to take another example, in Hamlet's instinctive reaching for his writing pad, his tablet or tables, on receiving the news from his father's ghost of the circumstances of his murders. The first thing he does, my tables, meet it as I set it down. As though the killing of the new king couldn't take place without this prior act of material inscription. Two scenes later, we will see Hamlet deploy in a letter to Ophelia a word whose ambiguity has kept critics busy ever since. Whilst this machine is to him, Hamlet. Whilst this machine is to him, Hamlet. Does machine here mean body, his corporeal apparatus and its geist, or the larger armature of circumstance and fate, or simply, as Stephen Connor has suggested, the contraption, the ink set and vellum that he writes on? The ambivalence will resonate all the way down to Heiner Müller. So, writing machines and primal scenes. If I've allowed myself the indulgence of dwelling on mine, then let me now turn to an episode that I consider to be the primal scene of modern writing tout court. In the classic Freudian tradition, it's a primal scene that already constitutes a reenactment, its own reconfiguration or performance. The time of this, though, this reenactment, can be pinpointed with exact precision. It takes place at 5:07 p.m. on the 21st of August, 1966, hitting the flung arc of the spooled ribbon. Back in Los Angeles, Rocher collated the developed snaps, and 1 year later, in 1967, published them in artist book form under the title Royal Road Test. Many of you will know this. I think Archivio Conz has a copy.
I do.
You do? Okay. It's a seminal work of 20th century art. No less than Hamlet or Macbeth, it turns around a regicide, not so much defenestration as beheading, the execution of the royal by the blade, the sabre. The book's epigraph, I have Hubertus to thank for this photo, the book's epigraph, it was too directly bound to its own anguish to be anything other than a cry of negation, carrying within itself the seeds of its own destruction, is lifted, although with the introduction of bad punctuation, is lifted from the Encyclopaedia Britannica's entry on Russian nihilism. And this amplifies the actions echoing of cultural and literal bomb-throwing. Incidentally, around that time, Rocher printed a faux phonetic version of his name on cards he handed out to help people pronounce it, Eddie Russia. Beyond immediate political allegory, what it enacts in a more generalized schema, I'd suggest, is sovereignty being shattered. The sovereignty of the subject, the autonomous, autarkic, bourgeois self, master of his own action and articulation, and by extension, the sovereignty of this self in the form of the artist or writer who masters his craft, works its machinery with delicacy and precision so as both to express himself and to transform the world into a set of works that might contain it within measured thought and language. This whole fantasy of integration and of empowerment is being smashed to pieces. But beyond this annihilation too, which we could quite comfortably assimilate to a Barthesian, after Roland Barthes, conception of writing as the destruction of every voice and point of origin, the bleak negative space where all identity slips away, starting with the very identity of the body writing, as Barthes beautifully puts it. Beyond even this, there's a third act of violence or annihilation taking place here, against writing itself, whose blood and guts, whose font and lettering, the very mechanism of whose possibility we see threshing and dying at the roadside. At the same time, though, and against this onslaught of Vernichtung, the Orphic scattering seems to fertilize the space around it, seeding it with lettered possibility. Miraculously, writing sprouts on bushes. The landscape seems magically altered or regenerated. That's his usual working method. Banner's substituted letters speak both of an inability on the part of the writing subject to accomplish or complete the act of writing, and of a futility sewn into that act's function and tools themselves, an auto-destructive abnegation or self-cancelling. This futility, which again I see as not just snagging, sabotaging or annihilating, but also constitutive, generative, has been noted and articulated in formulations more poetic than mine tonight. Maurice Blanchot, in his 1980 gem, The Writing of the Disaster, puts it hauntingly like this: to want to write, what an absurdity. Writing is the decay of the will, just as it is the loss of power and the fall of the regular fall of the beat, the disaster again. Beautiful. Don DeLillo dramatized it through, in the American novelist, dramatized it through the writer's block afflicted author Bill Gray in his 1991 novel Mao 2, in which the figure of the novelist is set against that of the terrorist. This is actually a still from someone else I've collaborated with, Johann Grimenpretz, from his seminal, so early, it was like 1998, his film Dial History, which has DeLillo's, that passage, that section from Mao 2 running through it as a kind of monologue. So in DeLillo's novel, the figure of the novelist is set against the figure of the terrorist, locked in what the writer Gray, the character the writer Gray calls a zero-sum game. What terrorists gain, novelists lose, he says. Years ago, he tells an interviewer, I used to think that it was possible for a novelist to alter the inner life of a culture. Now, bomb makers and gunmen have taken that territory. They make raids on human consciousness. Beckett, he claims, he calls him the last writer to shape the way we think and see. After him, he continues, the major work involves mid-air collisions and crumpled buildings. This is the new tragic narrative. Nonetheless, he still holds to the credo that, as he put it, there's a danger in a sentence when it comes out right. And he fantasizes typing out key sequence detonators over phone lines. You enter your code in Brussels, he says, and blow up a building in Madrid. In this respect, it's worth noting the fact that the Royal Typewriter Company, can we have the next slide? The Royal Typewriter Company, like Remington, which Hubertus mentioned the other day, the Royal Typewriter Company also made machine guns during World War II. I mean, the mechanism's the same, right? They also made machine guns during World War II. Also, that during that same period, Lines of poetry were indeed sent down the wires and through the airwaves by the British Secret Services, 1 in every 100 or so of which was code instructing the Résistance to blow up a bridge or assassinate a general, but the other 99 or so of which served as en clair dummies, buffers if you like, ellipses. They were meaningless. This history, which provides Cocteau with his model for the radio messages in his cinematic masterpiece Orphée, always sends my mind back when I think of it to W.H. Auden's famous assertion from In Memory of W.B. Yeats that poetry makes nothing happen. The line is usually misunderstood to mean poetry doesn't make anything happen, which understanding misses the assertion's positive, active voice that makes of nothing an event that, thanks to poetry, takes place, right? Poetry makes nothing happen. But an event, be that event, once more, Vernichtung, nothing-ing, or simply the hiatus of potentiality. Gray, though, the character in De Lillo's novel, never finishes his novel, leaving his assistant to muse as he cleans his master's abandoned typewriter that the withheld work of art is the only eloquence left. We go to the next one. Okay, back to the typewriter. Making nothing